Welcome to the Vertical Presents webinar program. Vertical Presents is a monthly webinar program that delivers webinars that are informative in nature, designed to help you learn more about the many facets of communications. And then you can also see what webinars are coming up by visiting vertical.com and navigating to the Vertical Presents page on our main page tiles. This month's webinar is on top 10 contact center deployment mistakes. This is a special guest webinar. It's the first that we've had, and it's presented by contact center expert Diane Halliwell. During the webinar, please mute your microphone for the entirety of the session. If you have a question during the webinar, please enter it into the chat function via the message icon on the lower left-hand side of the 8x8 meeting room. At the end of the webinar, Diane and I will answer all of your questions. You can also always email us with follow-up questions at vmarketing@vertical.com. Today's webinar will also be recorded. We'll send you the recording link tomorrow, but you can also always visit that again on our webpage. And then you can review sections or share the webinar with your colleagues. And then just one more final reminder to mute your microphone. That's all I have. Diane, it's all you.
Thanks, Rebecca. I appreciate it. And I just want to thank all of you out there for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend. And I want to thank the Vertical team for giving me the opportunity to present on a topic that I'm very passionate about. So thank you very much. I hope it will be very useful for you as we go through it. Before I get into the top 10 contact center deployment mistakes, however, I'm going to make a couple of overarching comments. I'm sure the audience represents very diverse contact center deployments, some very large and complex, some smaller deployments, but maybe no less complex, some cloud, and some on-premise. Very diverse out there. What I want to tell you, though, is regardless of your deployment, I want to caution you that if you run into a solution provider who takes the magic wand approach and tells you they can have things up and running, no problem, no effort here, please run the other way. Most of what you're going to hear in this presentation is years of experience watching my clients make these mistakes, or let's be honest, sometimes falling prey to them myself. So let's go ahead and take a look at the areas that we're going to cover today. You will notice as we go through there that they are not presented as mistakes, but the items are presented as remedies to potential mistakes. So in the, it's helpful if you actually turn the screen. What we're going to do is take a look at crafting an accurate scope of work and why that is so important. Getting the right people involved in the deployment. What are the critical steps in design that you have to take in order to make the deployment successful? We're going to target reporting, which is often an area that I find is missed until too late. We're going to look at current workflows, processes, and procedures, and you might wonder, what does that have to do with the contact center technology deployment? We're going to talk about a communication plan. And then one of my favorite topics, the power of testing and why testing on several different levels is so important. We're then going to talk about training and what may be something you need to look at very carefully as you're offered simplistic training plans. We're going to talk about cutover and the types of things you need to do to be successful at the very end. And then lastly, we're going to talk about knowledge transfer and what you need to manage the system and to utilize the system on an ongoing basis. So let's go ahead and get started with the crafting an accurate scope of work. This is certainly an area that organizations don't spend enough time on, I find. And it's a very, very important step. I would encourage you not to sign the standard scope of work that is offered by many of the solution providers. What's the reason for that? Well, you need to very clearly in the scope of work lay out roles and responsibilities, both the providers and the customers. Why is that important? Well, if it's not done, you may end up in finger pointing during the implementation that results in either additional cost to you or it results in a very negative working relationship. So let's take a look at the areas that I would recommend at a minimum you look at when you're doing the scope of work. First of all, what is the solution environment? Does the solution provider have a full scope of what's going on in your organization? What's the current environment? What changes will there be during this implementation? And what are the back-end integrations? All of these things could potentially be cost items as you move through there if they're not laid out during this particular step. Customer expectations. This is huge. What do you expect of the solution provider? Have you thought about who's expected to do the design? How will it be done? Who will do the training? What kind of knowledge transfer documentation are you expecting at the end of the deployment from the solution provider? Roles and responsibilities. We talked about this a second ago. If they're not clearly defined in a scope of work, you're going to have problems as you go through the implementation. I can guarantee it. Ongoing support. Are you clear on who's doing what after the implementation? And when does that after begin? That's often a very critical point to have laid out in the scope of work. Finally, service level agreements. And this again is part of your customer expectations. It's critical that they are clearly laid out. Are there going to be penalties associated with missed performance? And how do you track that? How do you work with the solution provider to know when those things occur? Okay, let's talk about the right decision makers involved. A contact center implementation should not be done in a silo. It impacts stakeholders across the organization. And these areas need to get involved from the start to avoid surprises along the way when it's too late to recover from those surprises. So let's look at the stakeholders that need to be involved. You got the contact center itself, but that's not just the contact center managers. That's the frontline agents, the supervisors, the training and the QA people, and business analysts. Each one of those stakeholders within a contact center has a different perspective of what the customer experience is, and they need to be part of the process. Then we've got our touch point owners. And I define a touch point as anything that touches your customers. That could be a web portal, that could be an interactive voice response, it could be a bot experience. You say, well, how come they need to be involved? Well, when you're implementing the solution, you may be adding contact center channels. You may be changing the way that your customers interact with you. They need to be involved because that may then impact what the current touch points are. You may have to put additional information on there to make it very clear to customers what their choices are now in contacting the organization. Let's move down to the second row. Business change management and operations staff. Okay, well, if you're adding a new channel, for example, or you're doing something very different in this implementation, these people need to be involved. They are the contact center staff often deals with different areas of the organization, back-end integrations, other departments. So business change management needs to be involved so that they understand what those changes mean to the organization and they can be prepared for those changes. Laying over this is the critical back office departments. You need to look at those existing workflows and determine potential changes to them given the contact center deployment and the scope of that deployment. And clearly the last area that's critical is IT and application development staff. They must be involved not only from a technical perspective to make sure all the elements are covered, but in some way after the implementation, they're going to be supporting you as a business and they're going to be supporting the solution. So they need to be involved to understand what's been included in the implementation and the design. Okay, critical design steps. This is one of my passionate steps. A design is the absolute foundational of this implementation. It is so important that you get the design right because the design will drive everything in the implementation. So let's take a look. No matter how complex or how simple your implementation is going to be, design should never be overlooked. Let's look at the areas we need to cover. The first thing you need to look at is you have current gaps in your functionality. You're going out, you're implementing a new system. What are those current gaps? What's not working today? What are you hoping is going to be resolved as you move forward with this implementation? Be educated on the capabilities of the new solution. I'm going to give you two reasons for that. Number one, you want to look at what the new solution can do and how that could potentially help you and how it could potentially help going forward in the customer experience and in the employee experience. But beyond that, be educated means, your terminology today in your current solution may be very, very different from the terminology of the solution that you're going to be implementing. I've seen meetings where people are going all over the place, and they have no idea what anybody's talking about in design because they don't understand the terminology. So part of that education is level setting the terminology and making sure you understand exactly what those capabilities are. All right, this one is near and dear to my heart. Anybody who knows me hates knows that three of my least favorite words in the English language are like for like. You know what your gaps are. You now know the new capabilities. On day one, you want to do what you can to make things better. No, you shouldn't try to do everything. You shouldn't try to implement all the bells and whistles because that's a lot to tackle, but you do need to make things better. Don't do what you're always doing just for expediency's sake or rushing to get an implementation in. Look at what the system can do for you. Don't settle for like for like. And then think beyond the current installation. We said you don't want to do everything today. You may not have the budget for it. You may not have the capabilities of making all the operational changes that need to be done, but have a plan and make sure that the stakeholders that we talked about are in tune with that plan and start budgeting for that plan at this point in time. Okay, let's look at reporting. Again, I said this is an area that we find most people don't really dive into, but we know in observing agents and observing supervisors and understanding and talking to managers, many contact centers live and die by their reporting. You can't assume that all solutions are the same when it comes to reporting. So you need to be very methodical in your approach here. In order to determine your reporting needs, I'd recommend you go ahead and start by reviewing your current reports. What do you need to continue to do? Are there custom reports that you currently have that must be carried forward? What are your current gaps in reporting? What are you trying to resolve? What are you not getting today statistically that you really need to get going forward? You need to understand required customizations. By getting educated on what the solution is that you're deploying, you need to make sure that the how they calculate certain statistics to level set that. And you may need the solution provider to do some customization to make sure that you can continue to get what you need going forward. Again, if key performance indicators are different, if they're calculated differently, you need to look at your current strategy for how you deal with agents in quality assurance. Do you need to establish some new key performance indicators? Depending upon the deployment, what you're doing from a technology basis, do you need new ones? Okay, and look at your quality assurance process and procedures. Do they need to change in any way? And then lastly, don't think of reporting only as that operational and contact center tactical reporting. What do your other stakeholders need? Your touch point owners, what do they need to see? What does senior management need to see? All of these key areas will feed into what your reporting requirements are and should be discussed during the implementation as part of the design. Okay, we talked about current workflows, processes, and procedures. Well, how is this important? How does this fit into a deployment of a technology implementation? Well, it's very important. Let's take a simple example of adding a new contact center channel. And let's just step through this process by just looking at adding a new channel. How do we do business today? Okay, are we voice only? How are we doing things? How are we set up? How are we communicating with our customers? What has to change? So we're adding a contact center channel. All right, maybe two or three of them. What needs to change from the customer communication? Maybe touch points have to change. Do we potentially have to hire different personnel? Do they have the skills to handle these new channels? Things could be very different, and we have to account for that ahead of time so that we're not surprised. What processes are needed? If we're going to go ahead and add a new channel, do we have to change workflows? Do we have to have some different processes in order to support those channels? All of that has to be built into the deployment as well. How do we train for the change? Well, we got to start building those processes and those channels and how to handle them into our training material, not only for agents that we're bringing on new potentially, but for current agents for retraining of them so that they understand what the differences are. What reports do we need? Okay, this is part of the report review. Do we need different key performance indicators to be built for the new channels? Do we need reports that show us what the customer experience is across channels. If I go from one channel to the other channel, am I capturing that full customer experience? Beyond that, I may need to define or redefine what first call, first contact resolution is. I can't look at channels in a silo perspective. I have to understand what the customer experience is within that realm. So, current workflows, processes, and procedures are extremely important, and we then need to look at how do we implement this change. And implementing that change covers each one of the areas that we just stepped through. Now, if we go to the next slide, I just want to make one very important point here, and I want to re-emphasize this. As you go through this implementation, you're investing a lot of time, you're investing money, you're investing staff resources. You want to take the opportunity during this implementation to look at, to examine, to evaluate what you're doing today from a process and operational perspective. You should review these things. New technology is not always going to solve those operational gaps and those problems. So take this opportunity to look at those and build those into your implementation scheme and make them better as you go through, as you make the technology better as well. Okay, your communication plan. We said that a contact center implementation involves many different stakeholders. This is kind of the drive it home slide. This is the one that says, okay, let's review these stakeholders. Let's make sure that our communication plan, sharing information, understanding what's happening in the deployment, goes to each one of these stakeholders. Clearly, your contact center staff is going to be impacted, potentially from a procedures perspective, a workflow perspective, potentially in contact channels that they handle, certainly in reporting. All of those different areas need to be addressed. Owners of touch points, we talked about the fact that they need to understand what that deployment is going to involve and what potential changes they need to make in time to make sure that all of this is aligned. Business change management staff, again, how important it is that they spot and they're aware of organizational changes that may need to happen because of the technology deployment. Then we've got our contact center support departments. What does that workflow look like today? How does that have to change? Your IT and development staff, they need to understand what things need to integrate with the current environment, how different things that are being developed right now are going to fit within the deployment. And the last one, don't forget your customers. They need to understand what you're changing and how it impacts them. So they are a critical stakeholder in your communication plan as well. Okay, another one near and dear to my heart, the power of testing. You must build this into your solution provider scope of work. You could do everything right in design, but if what you've designed doesn't work, that impacts everyone. It impacts your internal staff. It impacts the reputation of the firm as your customers are suffering through the deployment when nothing's working. Very, very critical that you do this. Make sure you know what the solution provider's normal testing includes, and depending upon the complexity of your implementation, do more. Now, let's look at each individual component. As you can see, there's several layers of testing we put here. And again, this is going to depend on the complexity of your deployment. But in a deployment, what I would recommend is you look at the individual components. Yes, the individual components need to work, but they are not the be-all and end-all. Ultimately, everything has to work end to end. Newly developed or modified applications, there needs to be a test environment that allows you to test these applications prior to implementation, prior to production. Integration with back-end systems and applications. This one is critical. Often you've got a lot of third-party groups involved in your back-end integrations, and a lot of scopes of work do not include the deployment solution provider testing with those back-end integration providers. What that allows is multiple finger pointing. Whose problem is it? When you have them involved in the end-to-end testing, that's going to be where you're turning up your problems. End-to-end testing, including carrier connectivity. Your customer's experience is end-to-end, so your testing has to be end-to-end. Every element, once tested on its own, now needs to be tested end-to-end to make sure everything is working. Load testing. I have seen multiple times where things work on a onesie-twosie basis. The minute you add stress, the minute you add load to that, things break. That's why load testing is such an important part and often a step that's missed. And then user acceptance testing. Once all of the technical testing has been completed, this is where the rubber meets the road. You bring in people who utilize the system, who know what the expectations are, to make sure that that design that's been tested technically is now working for you from a functional perspective in the customer interaction. This is a critical step. Disaster recovery testing. I have seen people go through design and put the most elaborate disaster recovery design in place, but never test it. And then the only time they find out is when the system breaks and you go, oh, shoot, our disaster recovery design didn't work. So that's critical that that be done. Now, one other point before we leave testing is hopefully this platform is going to allow you to grow with it and to add enhancements as you move forward. So, in my mind, it's extremely important to put this philosophy of testing into practice as you move to add applications, as you move to add new enhancements. So, having a test environment where you can do all those things is very critical to any implementation and ongoing support for the system. Okay, let's look at training. Another area that sometimes is just not done effectively. Don't cut corners on training. Don't take people's word for it that a simple web application or a simple web based training is going to resolve your needs. In order to make sure that you don't have on day one, having done the design beautifully, having done the testing beautifully, that you don't hear your agent saying, well, sorry, customer. I'm lamely going to explain to you that we just implemented a new solution and we're just still getting used to it. That's not something that the customer needs to care about. What you need to have is well-trained people who absolutely know how to utilize that system on day one. So how do you avoid that scenario? Well, make sure your training environment is what it needs to be, that it's conducive to effective training, allows role playing and mock contacts, and ideally it's not connected to a production environment. So it's separate, and anything that's happening in deployment or testing or production is not going to impact the training. Secondly, you need to look again at who your stakeholders are and what their training requirements are. Well, who are they? Agents, trainers, supervisors, quality assurance people, analytics people, managers. They may all have different requirements for training, and you need to involve that in a very comprehensive, well thought out training program. And then customized documentation. A lot of the documentation you get for training from your solution providers is going to be very functional in nature from a technical perspective. Take the time to develop the training that's going to have your processes, your workflows built in. And it's going to show the people, the stakeholders, what their actions, how they impact the customer interaction. So it's very, very important to make sure that you address training in a very comprehensive, well thought out plan. All right. So we've done the training, we've done the design, we've done everything we possibly can to make this work. Now we've got to look very carefully at cutover planning. Don't miss this step. Get all the right parties involved. We talk about a bunch of stakeholders here. Let's make sure that the appropriate, relevant stakeholders are included in that cutover plan. Get the right plan, get the right resources, and ensure that roles and responsibilities are perfectly clear. So those are the overarching concepts. Let's look at the individual components of this. Cutover prep and actual cutover. Who's going to be on site? Who's going to be off site? What are their roles and their responsibilities? What's the plan, including what's the backup plan if we have to stop and decide that we cannot go forward with this? What has to be tested now that cutover is actually happening? Some of the things that we've already tested need to be retested in production. And then who's going to coordinate all the activities? Who's going to make sure that the dependencies are met before we do one step of cutover, that I've done everything else that needs to be done to make that next step effective? You need a coordinator. You need a central point of contact who's running the show. After cutover, make sure you've got a plan for that. Who's on site? Who's remote? What are their roles and responsibilities? Okay, how am I going to handle troubleshooting? I need to have a procedure. I need to have a workflow. And very, very important, I need to have a close the loop process. I need to make sure that people's problems are resolved and that I've made sure that they're resolved to their requirements, not what I think is resolved. And then on site support. I need to have walkers, I need to have people in the appropriate areas with my agents, with my supervisors, with my managers, making sure that they understand what's going on. And if there's a problem with an interaction, they are walking right there, can run over to that agent and help them when they hold up a flag, hold up a sign, hold up their hand. That's critical in this process as well. Okay, finally, we talked about securing the proper knowledge transfer documentation. All right, you guys are going to live with this system for hopefully a fair amount of time. So you need to have documentation that's going to help you to understand what you've got. That at a minimum, that number one step, it's documentation for all the components of the system. This is technical documentation that your IT staff is going to need to have. Customized documentation of your specific implementation, the implementation, the design that was done for your firm. This is critical as you add new applications, as you add new functionality, to make sure that you understand, looking at your current documentation, what has to change. This allows you to examine and evaluate that so that you don't miss a step and break something that's already there. And then training documentation for retraining existing employees and training new employees. You don't need 100-page manuals for them to look at. You need cheat sheets, documentation that they're going to be easily able to find and to work with. Same thing for your supervisors. If they have emergency procedures, I need step-by-step things. I don't need manuals and reams of paper that I need to look through. Okay. On this picture, and actually I didn't look at it until this morning, and this kind of denotes my feelings about what a cutover should look like. I've seen cutovers where people are just in chaos, running around like crazy. My ideal cutover is everybody sitting in this room, staring at each other, happy, probably eating something, something's a spread that somebody brought in. Because you've done all the right steps, you've done the right design, you've done the right testing, you've done the right training, and then you've got the proper documentation that you need on an ongoing basis. You've had the right support. Cutover has gone very well. You've tested everything you needed to test, and things are working, and customers are happy, and agents are successful in the interactions with those customers. And that's what we got for you today. So, Rebecca, I'm going to turn it back over to you for any questions that might be out there.
All right. Thanks, Diane. That was wonderful. Everyone, please stay on mute. If you have a question, please enter it in using the chat feature. It's located on the lower left-hand side of your screen with the chat icon. We'll give you a minute or two to enter in questions there. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions immediately, but this webinar will be up on our Vertical Presents page later today. If you do have any questions for Diane, you can always email us at vmarketing@vertical.com, and we'll get those answered for you. Thank you so much for your time, Diane. This was a really wonderful presentation. We can't wait to have you back sometime.
Okay. Thank you very much, guys, and everybody have a great day.
All right. Thanks all. Bye.